Hello and welcome to part 2 of the landscape painting tutorial. Here we have the progress from part 1 where we focused on the sky and the background vegetation, and we sketched out the plan for the tree and the water. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that masking tape again, and after that top part is dry, I actually waited a couple days, I'm going to mask along the line at the top. And I'm just going to leave a little tiny bit of what I've painted showing so that when I paint what's below it, again, I'll have that nice clean edge. I'm just pulling it off here for a second because I want to plan out where the reflections of that area above is going to be in the water. And I want to make sure that I have equal spacing from that horizon line. So I'm just going to trace it in. Even though I did not end up using it on this side, I did the same here, just traced in the essentially what would be the mirrored version. You can see I was using my little pinchy fingers there again, just like we used in class, and just measuring from the top to the horizon line, and then back again from the horizon line to the bottom of the reflection. So I'm actually sketching in that line at the bottom of my piece of paper, and this is just in case I were to lose um, the line that I've already created above by painting over top, or um, just not being careful of my planning of where I'm going to place these things. I'm just checking the contours, making sure that they're the same, and I'm just putting some markings here for where I want the reflections to begin, where I want them to end. Let's see, I'm just taking some reference points, placing them at the bottom. So those are the colors I'm going to be working with today. Mostly I just work with the blues, a little bit of black, some whites, some brown, green and yellow. I'm going to start with essentially the furthest object back again, just like we started with the sky for the part 1. I'm going to start with the water, which is going to be the furthest layer below all the other objects. So I've just mixed some blue and some white to get a nice kind of light blue. It's going to be similar to that bottom blue value at the bottom of the sky where it meets the horizon line. And I've added a little bit of water, and that's just to make it flow and to make sure that the paint stays wet, because I will be mixing in some darker blue values over top. I'm kind of working fast at this point because I want to make sure that the paint stays wet so that the colors I apply over top will mix as opposed to just creating hard lines. You can use a wet brush over top of your darker values as well, and that'll do some blending. I do that a little bit later in the tutorial here. So I'm just going to darken up that value a little bit. I'm trying to get a darker value, kind of at the bottom of the water there. It's very much the sky and the water are a reflection when it comes to value. So the darker blue values are going to be at the bottom, most point of that pond or water area there, and then the lighter most values are going to be found closest to the horizon line. I'm just putting a little bit of variation there, so I have a couple patches or I guess lines, areas that are going to be darker. Now I'm actually grabbing the flat brush and I'm going to clean it off, and I'm just going to not put any paint on it, just use a wet brush, and I'm going to start blending those values together. Very similar to how the sky was completed. You can see it just softens up the edges, blends the values together, just really creates a better gradient or a transition between the different values and hues. After a while, your brush will pick up some of the blue values or the values you're going over, so you can almost like paint with it. It's a very light, kind of translucent layer. I'm using the edge of that brush because you want to create almost these lines in the water to create the kind of the texture or the reflection of how water appears. That's why I'm going in just with the flat edge of my flat brush. Getting it a little bit darker at this point. Again, putting some of those darker values at the bottom, kind of the area where the water meets the shore. Again, going in with the edge there and creating those kind of horizontal lines in the water's surface. I'm just making kind of those horizontal strokes back and forth. Just tossing a lighter value there, trying to match the light values in the sky, which are just on the or underneath that tape at this point. And all this paint's fairly wet, and that's why it's blending, that's why it's mixing and not just sitting on top of the previous layers. I'm just going to take that off for a sec, just take a look at the values, the lines. So now what I want to do is I want to focus on creating a reflection of that kind of vegetation or canopy there at the back. And so I'm just going to, again, trace the mirror's image using the horizon line as the mirror line. And I'm just sketching that in. I'm going to put that horizon line mask back down. And now I'm going to put back the tree. I'm just making sure that it meets up and joins with the top leaves on the tree there. I want to keep that edge sealed down so that I get that nice crisp horizon. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold down the tape at this point. My tape was really a little thicker than I would have liked to have used. And I'm just going to fold it over just so that I can see the color values that I used in that canopy, because I want to transfer those down into the reflection of the or on the water there at the horizon line. So I mix in some green, some blue, maybe a little bit of black. Really, I'm trying to get that really dark green that I used when I started the canopy there that I'm now doing a reflection of in the part 1 video. So I used that really dark green value, and then I progressively worked in lighter and lighter values. So I'm going to apply them again in kind of that horizontal line sort of approach. Even though the tree will eventually cover what I just did at the end of that application, I still put it in anyway, um, just to make sure if there's any kind of little bits that poke through or any kind of see-through leaves there on the edge, just in case I might need it, because I don't want to have to put that value in afterwards. Again, I'm always trying to work with the furthest layer back, and then I start working my way forward. I'm just trying to match up some of the I guess the taller lines or points that are on the top of the canopy with the bottom of the reflection. So I'm going to go in now with a little bit of a lighter green and just transfer some of those values that are in the actual vegetation in the background down into the mirror's reflection. I'm not going to go as detailed, but I want to have a fair amount of similarity so that the reflection looks semi-real. I've gone with a little bit of a thicker paint at this point because I want some of the green to sit on top of that darker, really deep dark green, just to kind of layer up the reflection a little bit. And I'm just going to pull that back, see what it looks like, and just make sure that it passes for a similar shape. So I mixed up a very light blue. It's got a lot of water in it because the edge, the very edge where the water meets the horizon, is typically lighter. Just kind of the light hits the very edge a little bit brighter. And so I'm going and I'm putting that right along the tape line. And I've even gone in with a little bit thicker white. And again, creating lines. Now I've switched over to a thinner tapered brush, so it has a finer point so that I can get more of a line quality to things. And I'm just going to break up that reflection that I put in the water with some lines to simulate the water texture as it kind of fades off into the distance. Yeah, just taking a look at it. So I'm going to toss in kind of some secondary lines. These might be a little bit thinner, have a little bit more water in the paint, a little bit thinned down. I'm going to place some behind the tree just to kind of simulate how the water is going to look. That one I just applied got a little bit thick, but I'll go ahead and I'll blend it in with a wet brush in a second here. That's what I'm doing now. I'm just taking a very wet brush and going right through the middle there to kind of split it to make it a little less opaque. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to start doing the tree. Now, I probably should have waited a little bit of time here for that paint I just put down to dry. I'm going to use the brown, and I'm going to mix in some white, and I'm going to create a mid-tone brown that I'm going to put down first. This is going to be fairly thick, and then I'll water down some darker and some lighter value browns later to create form in the tree. You see it's really, really thick on the brush, and that allows me to kind of create that tapered line with one kind of slow brush stroke. If you can't get the paint to flow like that, then you need a little bit more water in it. If you start seeing little white dots or trails where the paint's not just being applied to your paper, just put a little bit more water in it. Now the brown I was using was actually very watery to begin with. It's a different brand than the others. And I'm just creating that secondary branch now. And you can see I want to create a tapered stroke, so I want to have it go thicker to thinner. So I always start my stroke closer to the start of the branch and then drag out and lift the brush up slowly. And as I do that, the line will become thinner and taper. It'll get smaller. I always start where I want it thicker and then drag out to where I want it thinner. So I'm thinking about my light source there, and I want to think about where I want to have the light values and the dark values on the trunk of the tree there. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of black, watered down black with some brown. This paint is going to be much thinner than the paint I just put down. And I'm going to use that small, fine brush again. And I'm going to start applying it really to the right side of that tree because the light's kind of up in the top left corner, shining down above. the tree. So I'm putting the shadow on the opposite side, starting with the right side of the tree there. Same with the branches. And I'm just thinking about where the light would hit the branch and where the branch would be in shadow. And any place where it would be in shadow, I'm just going to toss down that darker value. Now create the texture of wood. I'm going to use horizontal lines. And these lines are going to be a little crooked, a little jagged, very fine. Might be very hard to see in the video here. But that's going to catch the edges of the bark and the rough surface. So as opposed to going horizontal with the water, we're now going to go vertical with the strokes. And kind of follow the branches as they split off there at the top. And same with the roots at the bottom. I'm just tossing slightly different value in there. It's kind of a thicker brown. And again, creating those vertical lines to create the texture, that rough texture on the bark of the tree. Now I've mixed some white into the straight brown there to create a very light value, and I'm going to put that on all the highlight surfaces, so all the surfaces which would be facing my light source. And again, I'm still working with those vertical lines, trying to do really fine, thin ones. Sometimes it's necessary to water down the paint just a little bit to get it to flow. And again, that's all creating a texture. So that's one of the kind of learning goals of this of these part videos for the landscape is, well, the masking technique, creating texture, and then the blending and gradients. So we've created a water texture, we've created a kind of a bark or a rough surface texture, we've created a leaf texture, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start applying a texture to the top of the tree there. So I've taken an older flat brush that's kind of split, and I've roughed up the edges to kind of make the bristles stick out a little bit more. That's because I'm going to kind of start dabbing the paint down for the canopy of the tree. And this is going to be a very similar technique to what we did with the vegetation, which is at the background or in the background, how I started with a very dark value and then progressively worked lighter values up into it. That's going to be very much the same process here. So you can see that very dark green value, and I'm going to cover really the entire area of where the leaves are going to be in this value to start. And this would be very similar to an underpainting. I'm creating that darkest value at the back, and then I'm going to progressively lay lighter values on top. Now at times you might actually start with a light value and kind of work backwards, but for what I'm trying to accomplish here, I'm again going with that really dark green value. And that was the green mixed with a little bit of black, maybe a little bit of blue. I'm making sure to overlap the branches too, so that I don't have any spaces or any kind of awkward negative shapes. And I'm just using a slightly thicker value of green here, and I'm just tossing in kind of some differentiation in the values you can see in the dark green, because that's really what this process is all about, is creating a bunch of different values to simulate that leaf texture. I don't want the canopy to look too perfect, so I'm going to kind of create these little brush strokes sticking out. I want it to look very much organic. You can see how I'm just showing the technique of how I'm kind of laying the brush down and dabbing with it, as opposed to kind of brushing it into the surface. So I've gone with a darker value here, and again, I'm going to apply this to the bottom of the patches of leaves, or where I kind of imagine them in my mind's eye. I'm going to start putting the dark values at the bottom, so the furthest area away from the light source. And I've kind of in my mind imagined kind of clumps or masses of these leaves, and I'm just kind of dabbing in the dark values for the where the form would either roll away into another form or mass of leaves, or the opposite side of the light source. And the paint consistency at this point is pretty thick, just to build up these layers. So I'm mixing some of the green into there and some white, just to kind of lighten up the values and progressively work in lighter, at times paler shades of green into the canopy. Just the more values I can create, and the more brush strokes or tiny little markings I can make, the more this is going to look like a leaf type texture. And I'm kind of putting this value at the top of where I just placed those darker green values. I'm just trying to think of the form, where the leaves would stick out, clump together, how they would kind of flow together. And bringing some out into the sky, just on the edges there to create that rough texture. Not rough, I guess, more leaf texture. Got a little bit lighter still, and I've added a little bit of water in here. I'm going to start placing these kind of more saturated green values, these lighter, brighter green values, at the top edge of that kind of pale green that I just put down. So again, I've got a little bit lighter there. I think I mixed in the tiniest bit of yellow into there as well. And again, now I'm placing it on the areas which would be closer to the light source. So now I'm getting some yellow here. And that's just to add a little bit of kind of emphasis color or focal color. Um, and again, to kind of try to bring this tree forward so I can separate the canopy of the tree from the background behind it. After I'd done the tree, I realized I probably should have done that background a little bit of a darker value. But I'm going to go ahead and just toss some kind of yellow values just to show the kind of the specular highlights and create again some kind of focal area that the eye gets drawn to. And then I've gone in there with some white with a tiny little bit of yellow in it. Again, all these areas would be the areas which would be in direct line with the light source. So now that the water is dried a little bit here, um, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some white, a little bit of blue in it, and I'm going to create a few more lines in the water there. So again, I'm trying to separate that tree or create some kind of forced perspective there. So if I have that white line cutting through behind the tree, it then creates overlapping perspective. And I know that that tree is in front of the water and in front of the reflection. So I'm just going to add some more lines, kind of inferred lines at times. So that's where they kind of start and stop. So I'm going in with a little bit of a darker value. And just how you had those kind of lighter white lines, highlight lines at the back closest to the horizon. Now I'm going to put some darker lines closer to the shore, just like when we did the underpainting and started putting those first values down. The lighter blue values were closer to the horizon, darker blue values closer to the shore and the bottom of the water there. So I'm just going to put a couple lines in here. I am going to blend them in a second here with a wet brush. There we go. Just to kind of take the harsh opaque punch out of them. Just going to pull some of those white values, just tone them down a little bit. And there we go. So that's part 2. There will be a part 3 coming up where we will finish off the shore.